This segment was originally recorded in October of 2008. Enjoy. By now, most Americans know that there are two main branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia. But there's also another Islam. Sufism is the mystical, metaphysical side of Islam, the Islam of the famous poet Rumi. And they, like us, are targets of Wahhabi fundamentalist rage. Author Stephen Schwartz says that Sufi Muslims are our natural allies against Islamic terrorism, and that it could help bridge the gap between the Muslim and Western worlds. His book is called The Other Islam. Stephen Schwartz joins me in the studio. Stephen, welcome.
Thank you. Very glad to be here.
Now, briefly explain to us, if you would, what a Sufi Muslim believes.
Well, a Sufi Muslim believes the same things that a Sunni or Shia Muslim believes in. That is, one God, the revelation delivered to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi salam, the Quran, and generally most Sufis accept the Hadith, and which are the oral sayings of the Prophet, and accept the corpus of Islamic law in whichever form is applied in the place they live. But the Sufi is more concerned with personal, internal cultivation, meditation, contemplation, and with having a personal relationship with God than with ritual. That's the basic difference. The Sufi is not concerned particularly with ritual observance or practice of Islam in an external way. Sufism is the Islam of the heart, and it follows the great Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali, who said that God will not judge people by their actions, but by their intentions. And Sufis concentrate on intentions, and that is in the heart.
So if a Muslim Sufi can be either Sunni or Shia, is Sufism more of a temperament, if you will?
Well, a Sufi can be definitely either a Sunni or a Shia, and some of the most distinguished Sufis were Shias. I wouldn't say it's so much a temperament, because there are several ways of being a Sufi. It's an outlook, it's an attitude. There are some Muslim communities in the world, Bosnia is an example, Kazakhstan is another example, where the whole Islam of the whole country is Sufi-oriented. There are other countries in the Muslim world, Morocco is an example, where Sufism is very well organized in communities called tariqats. Then there's a kind of social Sufism in Indonesia that tries to assist the poor and the needy in society. Now we have in Turkey a kind of political Sufism that aims at involvement with government. That's problematical for me. And in the West we have a kind of New Age Sufism, which is a Sufism of spiritual seekers. But I'd say it's an attitude and an outlook, but it does involve a commitment, it involves study, it involves work, spiritual work.
So as I understand it, Sufism was actually influenced by Christianity, in particular Eastern Christianity, and the asceticism of the Eastern monks and monasticism, as well as in some areas influenced by Hinduism.
Well, the Christian Orthodox monks are specifically praised in Quran, and Sufism, when Sufism emerged, it emerged in a society, basically Iraq, where there was pretty strong presence of Eastern Christianity. And yes, it was influenced by Eastern Christianity. It was influenced by Zoroastrianism, what we call the wisdom of the East, Zoroastrian mysticism, Hindu mysticism. And then Sufism, in turn, has an encounter with Western Christianity in Spain, and then later with Judaism. So it's always had this relationship with the other religions.
Now, Sufism has been called Christianized Islam. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's an interesting theory that was put forward by a particular Spanish Catholic scholar, Miguel Asín Palacios, and I respect Asín Palacios' work very much, but I think that in some respects he somewhat overstated the case. Actually, I would say that Sufism in a certain way represents an Islamization of Christianity in Spanish conditions, but Asín Palacios used this term Christianized Islam. This is part of the character of Sufism, is that the membranes between the religions, the borders between the religions, tend to disappear for Sufism. Sufism is definitely a form of Islam that is more oriented to Christian traditions than Islam in general, but Islam, as most people should know, accepts the status of Jesus as one of the great prophets, and Muslims honor Jesus.
Stephen Schwartz is in the studio with me. He's an author and journalist. He's the executive director of the Center for Islamic Pluralism. The book we're discussing is called The Other Islam, Sufism and the Road to Global Harmony. Now, you make the point in the book that Sufis are peaceful but not pacifists. Are there jihadists Sufis?
Yes, there are jihadist Sufis. There's no denying it. There are two ways of looking at this. There are Sufis who have been drawn into the struggles that have taken place to defend Muslims. For example, in Algeria, when the Algerians were fighting against the French in the 19th century, the greatest leader of the Algerians was Sufi Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. And he said something that I quote a lot. He said, for the Sufi, jihad is the most difficult duty. And he said also that in jihad, the duty of the Muslim and of the Sufi is to protect the innocent non-Muslims. Peaceful but not pacifist, aiming at peaceful resolution, peaceful relationships, but that does not mean willing to suffer aggression or violence. There are other examples. There were another example that I quote in my book. There were some Sufis who joined in fighting against the U.S. troops when the U.S. troops came into Iraq. But then as they saw that, particularly in the town of Fallujah, as they saw that on the one side were American troops and on the other side were Wahhabi invaders from Saudi Arabia who basically would kill them for being Sufis, kill them for listening to music, kill them for visiting graves, which are things that Sufis do and Wahhabis don't like. They, in essence, decided that it was better to live with the Americans than to have to suffer under the rule of the Wahhabis. So there are jihadist Sufis. I would say most Sufis are not jihadists. The jihadist Sufis are a minority.
Now, why did the Sufis come under attack from other Muslims? Why are they considered heretics?
Well, beginning in the 13th century, a gentleman appeared who at the time was not taken very seriously by anybody. His name was Ibn Taymiyyah. And Ibn Taymiyyah was a person who believed that Islam had become a civilization and has grown out into the Middle East and then further into Persia and into India, and as it had grown toward the West and Morocco and Spain, that it had lost its purity, that it had lost its original simplicity and purity, and he saw that Islam had borrowed spiritual wisdom and spiritual customs, the study of philosophy, that Islam, like any other great religion, had taken a lot from the other religions. And he said this was not acceptable. Islam had to be stripped of anything that wasn't there in the original Islam of the Prophet. Well, Ibn Taymiyyah was pretty much, and Ibn Taymiyyah, by the way, let me add, also had a particular hatred of the Sufis, and he had a special hatred of the greatest of the Sufis, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi, who was a Spanish Muslim.
Why? Why a particular hatred?
Well, he was, Muhyiddin Ibn al-Arabi is the most creative of the Sufis. He said that, his heart was open as a temple to the pagans and as a church for the Christians, as a synagogue for the Jews, and as a mosque for the Muslims. And he was the one that can be seen as having the broadest view of Islam in the universe and of the unity of the whole of creation with God. This was all simply, Ibn Taymiyyah was a very narrow-minded person who saw Islam in a very narrow context, very narrow perspective. And so Ibn Taymiyyah began the practice of declaring the Sufis to be a wholesale heretics outside of Islam. Not people who had committed errors or who had fallen into heresy, but people who were not really Muslims. Ibn Taymiyyah was basically ignored until the 18th century, and then a gentleman appeared in the wilds of Arabia named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism. And he picked up the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah, and he popularized them popularized isn't exactly the word, but he recruited people who, by violence, spread his ideas throughout Arabia. And he said the same thing. He said that that the Islam that had become a civilization was not pure Islam, that it was tainted by its contacts with the Christians, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Zoroastrians, and that all of these things had to be taken out of Islam. And he specified certain practices, which he said, because in Islam we believe that there's only one God and you only worship God. You don't worship Muhammad, you don't worship saints, you don't worship anything except the one God. But according to Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, if you decorated a mosque, that was turning the mosque into an idol. If you pray at the tomb of a saint, or say that there's such a thing as a Muslim saint, you're creating an idol. You're creating a partner for God. And according to the Wahhabis, the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, this is imitating the Christians. The Christians, according to the Wahhabis, the Christians put Jesus alongside God as an object of worship, and according to the Wahhabis, the Sufis put the Muslim saints alongside God as an object of worship. Well, none of us worships a saint.
And was that enough to encourage other Muslims to start persecuting the Sufis?
Well, frankly, Ibn Abdul Wahhab would probably have been ignored, except that he made an alliance with a tribe, which was the tribe of Al-Saud, Al-Saud. And the agreement they made was the Al-Saud would handle political affairs and the family of Ibn Abdul Wahhab would handle religious affairs. They would intermarry and they would create a theocratic community, and that's exactly what they did. That's why we have a country today called Saudi Arabia, and the relationship continues in Saudi Arabia today. The head of the Muslim clerics of Saudi Arabia, the top religious authority in the country, is a direct descendant of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and the rulers are the direct descendants of Ibn Saud, and they continue to intermarry and they continue to rule the country. And as everybody knows, I think, they rule the country in a very reactionary and repressive way. It's the only country in the world where women can't drive.
We're discussing Sufi Islam. The author is Stephen Schwartz, and the book is called The Other Islam, Sufism and the Road to Global Harmony. You're listening to The Mimi Gerges Show. We're on the web at mgshow.org. Stephen, you say this in your book, quote, "The radical Islamist enemy cannot be beaten without an effective, determined Muslim counter-jihad assisted by Westerners." First, what do you mean by a counter-jihad?
Well, what we have to do as Muslims is we have to formulate an answer, develop an answer to the radicals. The radicals now have domination over many Muslim communities. Not all Muslim communities, but many Muslim communities are dominated by Saudi-funded radicals, and in a few places by Iranian-supported radicals. And we have to make the religion a normal religion again. No religion can survive if it's in a constant state of radicalism and extremism. In the other great monotheistic religions and in Buddhism, radicalism and extremism are marginal phenomena. Islam is the only one of the great world religions in which there's this problem of domination by radicals. Well, obviously, this has got to end. Islam has got to become, once again, a regular, normal religion which people practice in a way that is not threatening to themselves, to other Muslims, or to their neighbors. And
how can that be done? Particularly, how can Sufis do that?
It's actually a lot simpler than one might think. Sufism has come to represent, I hesitate to use this term because it might sound too Californian, but Sufism has become a kind of counterculture in Saudi Arabia, and it's very strong in the opposition in Iran. And all it really takes is for the Muslims to mobilize against the radicals and to talk and argue and debate and organize and do the things that are necessary to assert mainstream, normal, non-threatening, non-radical Islam against the radicals. The Sufis play an important role in spiritual mobilization, in giving the anti-radicals what I might call the intellectual tools to do this, but it also involves certain political measures. I mean, it's going to. Right now, Wahhabism is a state religion in Saudi Arabia. If the king of Saudi Arabia, who I believe is a reformer, and at CIP we believe that King Abdullah is a reformer, if King Abdullah will get up and say Wahhabism is no longer the state religion in this country, and we now have pluralistic Islam and we have general religious freedom, that'll be an enormous step forward. So if Saudi, if and when, because it will happen eventually, when Saudi Arabia takes Wahhabism down from its position of monopoly and religious authority, and when the clerical state ends in Iran, this will resolve an enormous part of the problem. And Sufis will play an important role in both of those developments.
Now, in the struggle, though, for the younger Muslim, for the hearts and the minds of the younger Muslim, how is Sufism going to attract those people as opposed to the more hardline Wahhabi version when there's really not a lot of Sufi jurisprudence out there and available for these young people to go to? You know, there's no Sufi interpretation or commentary on the Quran. There's not a lot of documentation.
Well, there's certainly Sufi commentary on Quran, and there's a great deal of Sufi material, but you're right, most of it has not been translated into English. Most of it is in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. But a lot of it's there. The problem, if I may say so, with the younger Muslims is that the younger Muslims want a simple Islam. And Islam is, this is one of the ways in which Islam is like Judaism. Judaism and Islam both say that the believer has to study. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, it's better to read a page than to pray. It's better to read a page of Quran, to read a page of commentary than to pray. The younger Muslims, in my experience, they're living in the same world as all other young people are living in, where they want things fast, they want things simple, and there's nothing simpler than Wahhabism. Wahhabism just tells you, believe a few things, hate the non-Muslims, hate the other Muslims, do what we tell you to do, and you're okay.
But it's not just simple. I mean, there's written documentation in Islamic jurisprudence, in the Quran, in the Sunnah, the Hadith, that justifies some of these beliefs. For instance, the beating of women or the killing of apostates. I mean, it's widely accepted. Now, I think probably the Sufi would tell you, no, just ignore that. No, be gentle and kind with everybody.
Well, the killing of apostates is in a hadith, and all hadith are subject to argumentation. And actually, the question of apostasy is fairly new, and is not a settled question in Islam. I agree with you. There are elements of the Sunnah, of Quran, the Sunnah, and the Hadith that can be used by the radicals, but there are just as many, if not more, elements of Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah that can be used by the Sufis. For example, Quran itself says there's no compulsion religion. And traditional Islamic theology says that Islam stands between conviction and doubt. Those are hallowed and accepted Islamic principles of theology.
But why does it seem like that interpretation is losing to the hardline interpretation?
Well, I wouldn't say it is losing, but I would certainly say that the hardline interpretation appears to have more power in the real world at the present time, and frankly, it's not difficult to see a connection between the hardline interpretation, Wahhabism, the Saudi government, and the energy industry. I mean, they have the money. Saudi Arabia has had this privileged relationship with the United States. Saudi Arabia has control of the holy cities. It has control of the Hajj. And Westerners and a lot of young Muslims look at Saudi Arabia and say, oh, well, that must be the place where Islam comes from and where Islam is somehow the best. I had an interview on Canadian broadcasting where the interviewer asked me, well, wasn't the Prophet Muhammad born in Saudi Arabia? And I said, well, no, because Saudi Arabia didn't exist till 1932. It's a question of money and power. Now, against that money and power, we are going to have to mobilize the ordinary believers. But the ordinary believers, the Muslim believers, are everywhere. It's something of a paradox that in terms of Sufism, debate, controversy, opposition, and what I would call the more normal and traditional interpretations of Islam, they're actually stronger among the masses of people living in Saudi Arabia and Iran than they are among Muslims in the United States, because Islam in the United States is very, very much influenced by that Saudi relationship.
You also mentioned that in order to do this, in order for the Sufis to mount this counter-jihad, there needs to be assistance from the West. what would that assistance look like?
Well, the phrase I use is respect, but don't try to recruit. Meaning that, first of all, I've experienced myself the fact that American Western diplomats in the Muslim world don't take the Sufis seriously. There's this prejudice, and here we are in the Washington area where this prejudice is particularly strong. There's a prejudice on the part of Western governments to say, well, we officially represent the West, so let's talk to the official clerical representatives of Islam. So they will say, in any country where there are a lot of Sufis, I experienced this especially in the Balkans, they'll say, well, we're talking to they'll either say they're not talking to the religious leaders at all, or they'll say, well, if we have to talk to religious leaders, we'll talk to the official clerical religious leaders. If you say, well, here in this particular area we have 50 Sufi sheikhs, and lots of people follow them, and they have a lot of authority, why don't you go talk to them? I've been told things by Western government officials like, oh, that's not regular Islam, that's folk Islam. All those people are doing is whirling around. How can we talk to them? First of all, the Western representatives have got to understand that they have to talk to the Sufis. They have to know about the Sufis. They have to understand that in some countries like Morocco, the Sufi sheikhs have much more power than the official clerics. The second thing is, and this is, I think, extremely obvious, wherever the Sufis are under attack, a particular case I know about is in the Balkans and Macedonia, where Wahhabis are trying to take the properties of the Sufis away, Western human rights organizations and Western governments should step in and make it part of their mission as defenders of human rights in the global sense to defend the Sufis. But it has to
But in what way, Stephen? Because this is always a bit controversial when there's a persecuted group and there's a call for the United States to defend them.
Well, all it would take in Macedonia, for example, is for the United States to say to the Macedonian government, there are reports in the city of Tetova that radical Wahhabis armed with AK-47s are driving the Sufis out of their property that they've owned for 300 years. Don't you think it's important to go out and make sure that those Sufis can keep their property? That's a pretty simple deal for the Macedonian government to undertake. Also, that the United States government should publicize these actions when they take place. Another country like this is Iran, where the Ghanabadi Sufis are being harassed and arrested, and their places of meeting are being shut down. The United States government can at least take a public stand about this, can at least call attention to it. I'm not saying we land the Marines there, but certainly our diplomatic representatives can call attention to these violations of human rights and can make it clear that, you know, the First Amendment of our Constitution, which I defend, forbids the U.S. government to become associated with a religion per se, but it does not prevent us, and Congress has passed laws about this. In fact, our government is mandated to protect oppressed religious groups. And we do try to protect oppressed religious groups, whether it's the Copts in Egypt or to some extent the Tibetan Buddhists. Well, we should put the Sufis pretty high on that list because they're people we can talk to. But we can't recruit them. We can't say, okay, we're your allies, so now you have to fight for us. Because, and the reason for that is Sufism has to remain autonomous. It has to follow its own road. Sufism is a spiritual way. It's not something that can be hired to do the work of the West.
I mentioned the poet Rumi in the introduction, and I'd like to close with a poem of his. Would you just set it up for us and then read us a couple of lines?
Yes, Jalaluddin Rumi is, they say, the most widely read poet in the West today. One of his verses, which is widely quoted in the Muslim world, is this: "Whoever you may be, come, even though you may be an unbeliever, a pagan or a fire worshipper, come. Our brotherhood is not one of despair. Even though you may have broken your vows of repentance 100 times, come."
Stephen Schwartz, he's an author and journalist, also executive director of the Center for Islamic Pluralism. The book is The Other Islam, Sufism and the Road to Global Harmony. It's published by Doubleday. Stephen, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much.
That interview was recorded in October of 2008. If you missed any part of that, you can take a listen on our website, mgshow.org. All the interviews are posted there. We're looking for sponsors for the program, so if you have a nonpartisan message to get out to our highly intelligent audience, please get in touch with me. We'll thank you on the air profusely. My email is mimi@mgshow.org. You can also follow me on Twitter at Mimi Gerges. That's MIMIGEERGES. And please do give us a Facebook like. The handle is Mimi G Show. Then there's also the YouTube channel, which is called The Mimi G Show, where if you can't seem to get enough of me, you can watch a video of my interviews. Thanks for listening.